Hi, everyone. Welcome to Forbes Talks. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Maggie McGrath, Forbes women editor. Maggie, the most powerful women list is out. I find it fascinating. Let's start with number one. First of all, congratulations. It's a huge lift. But Christine Lagarde, number two. Number one, is it Ursula von der Leyen, the EC president? Why are they the most powerful women on the planet?
Well, thanks, Diane. Yes, this is the 19th year we've done the list and we have a new number one. I want to just zoom back. For most of the years we've done this list, we had Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, at number one. So in those years, it wasn't much of a discussion to figure out who number one was. It was, she was a singular figure overseeing a massive GDP, a large population, a huge decision maker for Europe. So this year we always look at who was on the list in prior years. So Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission. She first made this power list in 2019, the year of her appointment to that position. Christine Lagarde has been on the list a number of times. She is currently the head of the ECB, European Central Bank. Before that, she was running the IMF. So she is a familiar figure on this list. But, they ranked pretty highly last year. So when it came time to look at this year's list, we looked again at their purview. Ursula von der Leyen crafts policy that affects 450 million people within the EU. And Christine Lagarde has huge decision-making powers over monetary policy, which can move markets. So we were looking at these two, and they were really kind of neck and neck, and we were really debating who has more influence. And the tiebreaker, if you will, or it really became clear as I started talking to sources about how von der Leyen has actually empowered her own position. I think I'm not someone who's a European policy geek, so I would have been hard pressed to tell you who her predecessor was before I started reporting on this list.
Probably not a woman.
It was not a woman. I knew she is the first woman to hold this role, but she is someone who has international standing in large part this year because of her leadership on Russia. She has imposed sanctions, and she's been the one with that decision-making power. She was one of the first high-ranking European officials to visit Ukraine and to visit Ukrainian forces. She has made statement after statement and sanction after sanction, really trying to punish Russia for its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine.
Now, one of the things that I think is fascinating, anything political in the U.S. is controversial, but talk about Kamala Harris and what her power is right now from where you sit. Obviously, it's a very powerful position to be vice president, but is there anything else that really sort of propelled her up the charts this year?
Well, for the last year, she's been the tie-breaking vote, or the last year and change, really.
Right.
Biden entered office, she has been the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. We will find out, if not tonight, if not tomorrow, in the near future might be the best way to say, how the Georgia runoff goes and whether or not she'll continue to be the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. But, this means that she can come in and, cast the die and affect the way the vote goes. So she is a number two, and we have to take that into consideration here. If she were president of the United States, no vice, she would be number one on this list, no question. Because she is vice, that's where we start to debate, okay, Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission. She has power over policies and budgets in a way that, unfortunately, Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, despite being the first Black, first Asian, first female vice president in United States history, does not.
So when we talk about the power list, one of the things that I think is always interesting about this list versus the other lists I've seen, the other ones tend to be populated with a lot of corporate leaders, it's the people who are the few CEOs in corporate America. You have some of them, obviously, I see on the list, Karen Lynch, et cetera. How do you think about power? And has it evolved at all? Because you have philanthropists there. I know, so you've got Mackenzie Scott, you've got Melinda French, Gates. Is there a way that you're defining power differently, or it's hard to quantify when you go across these different areas?
It's very hard to quantify. And just to take a step back, this list does measure a lot of metrics of hard power. We look at money. So, as I've referenced, we do look at the gross domestic product of a country if a woman is at the head of state of that country. We look at the size of the population that her policies affect. On the corporate side or entrepreneurial side, we look at revenue, we look at market cap, we look at number of employees. That's why you see people like Julie Sweet, who's the head of Accenture, has a huge employee population, a six-figure employee population around the globe, right? So we look at those hard metrics, but then we also measure media mentions and we look at spheres of influence. And that's where people like Mackenzie Scott, Melinda French Gates, Laureen Powell Jobs, these philanthropists can come to the forefront. Also, Dolly Parton is on our list for the first time this year, in large part because, she has always been known for her philanthropy and most famously recently gave money that contributed to the research that produced the Moderna vaccine for COVID. But this year, she won an award from Jeff Bezos, Mackenzie Scott's ex, for $100 million to give away at her disposal. That's a tremendous amount of power. And she's someone with such a track record of charitable giving that we see that as worthy of being included on this list. So yes, there's metrics of hard power for sure on this list, but we also want to make sure that we're highlighting people who are making an impact, who are using their positions and their platforms and their voices for change.
It's been I suppose, a mixed year for women, Maggie, with regard to what we've seen from the Supreme Court. And has that changed the landscape at all? Because one of the questions that always comes up, anything with women, of course, is why are you guys still doing a list? Just do most influential people. I mean, how do you think about it? You're Forbes Women editor. Has your mindset shifted this year in terms of how you're thinking about power, just given what's going on in the external environment?
Oh, absolutely. I will confess to feeling conflicted. Here we are editing a list, publishing a list about the world's most powerful women, some of whom gained power within their sphere of influence, in a year where women in the United States lost a right. This is the biggest rollback of women's rights, the repeal of Roe v. Wade, that we've seen in the 2 decades we've been doing this list. I do think it's important to measure power, though, because I think it's important to hold people accountable. So to that end, I published a story this morning as part of the package, looking at how the women on this list are using their voices and acting for reproductive rights. We heard Janet Yellen testify in front of the Senate. She's number 33 on this list. She's the Treasury Secretary. And she said in very plain terms that abortion access and abortion care is an economic issue. It is fundamentally an issue that affects women's earnings and overall wealth creation. And she got critiques for saying that that sounds cold or whatnot. But at the end of the day, the decision about whether or when or with whom to have kids is one of the most personal decisions a person can make, and one of the things that can affect a person's earnings more. I'm stuttering because I'm having trouble thinking of things that can be more impactful to a woman's individual earnings. So that's a long-winded way of saying I understand those who say we should be looking at influence, but I also think it's important to say these are the world's most powerful women. These are the ones who are acting out for and or supporting reproductive rights. And these are the ones who, quite frankly, are not. And to that end, I would point to the new Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. I heard from one source who was like, what the? Why is she on the list? Italy has one of the 10 largest GDPs in the world, according to the World Bank. Meloni's very far right. Her party has a record of abortion restrictions, and I think that makes women concerned. So concerned, in fact, that Italian women poured into the streets after her election in September. So I think this list is a good way of, in some ways, keeping track of who these power players are and what they're doing.
Who are some of the newcomers you'd put on our radar, Maggie?
There are 16 newcomers this year. I think the one that I would want to highlight the most right now is actually a first in list history. We have a posthumous listing. We looked, as always, at the news stories that are affecting all people, but particularly women. And we looked at the women who are marching for their rights in Iran. And we kind of asked ourselves, what's the best way to tell that story through this list? And we decided to list Gina Mahsa Amini. Gina is her Kurdish name. She was killed at the hands of Iran's morality police in September. The Iranian government denied their involvement, but when reports got out about her death and photos, and this was at the hands of two female journalists who are now in jail, um, it erupted. The story erupted. People poured into the streets. Her funeral turned into a protest. And it started as a protest against the Iranian regime's treatment of women. By law, women are treated as second-class citizens in Iran. But gradually, these protests grew. They grew across the world. We saw allies and
I was in Miami
Iranian...
for a protest, actually. I saw a big protest down there with her face in all the posters.
Her name has turned into a hashtag that's been used. We cut off the data at November 30th, so I'm sure it's been more since, but as of November 30th, 79 million times the hashtag Mahsa Amini has been used. One of my sources told me, her name, her face, her image has become a symbol for the quest for freedom. And indeed, it's not just women in the streets now, it's men, it's people of all genders, and they are fighting for regime change. They will not stand for small, mealy-mouthed measures. They will not stand for surface level improvements. They really are protesting for their rights. And it is one of the longest protests we've seen in Iranian history. As of this recording, it's 80 days strong. And I think it surpassed what anyone would have expected at the time. And to an earlier point that I made about we look at media mentions and reach and spheres of influence, we do look at how many times people have been talked about in the press. And Mahsa Amini ranked in the top 10 of all the media mentions for all the women on the list, and the rest of them are living. So we felt that this was merited.
No, very interesting. Great food for thought. And I obviously recommend people check out the list. It always makes me think, and it makes me think about power and how it's changing. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Diane.